Good. Welcome, everyone. So nice to see you all. I'm delighted to be here today with Michelle King, editor of Joyland. Welcome, Michelle. Great to see you.
Thank you so much for having me, Becky. It's delightful to be here.
Yeah. So as always, you guys know the drill. Any questions that you have, just go ahead and type them into the chat and I will work them into the conversation with Michelle. So Michelle, why don't you jump things off? Just take it away. Tell us how the magazine started, when it started. I don't know if you were part of its original founding, but if you were, take us through the origin story, and when you came on board, if it wasn't at the beginning.
Sure. The magazine started in 2008 by the writer Emily Schultz, and I was not around in 2008. And when it first started, it was with this idea that it was going to be a literary journal in multiple time zones. Emily really wanted it to not be a journal just by people based in Brooklyn for people based in Brooklyn. And so at the time there was the Northeast, there was the West, the South, and then Consulate, which was sort of this catch-all for anywhere outside of the States. I came on in 2015 and I was a reader. I was still in graduate school at the time. I saw a call on social media that Joyland was looking for readers. I'd been published by Joyland before, and I had a friend who was an editor at the magazine. I applied to be a reader, but I'd never worked at a literary journal before. And I learned so much from that experience. I really got an understanding of why a story, even a good story from the slush, might not necessarily make its way to publication. And when I'm talking to writers who are at the early stages of their career, I definitely recommend being a reader for a journal if it makes sense. Like I said, I was in graduate school, so I was getting a stipend from Joyland, but I understand that being a reader is not something that is going to make sense for everyone. But it was a great educational experience for me. I then became the managing editor of Joyland and was the managing editor for about 2 years. And then one day, Emily took me out to lunch and she said, I'm in a different place in my life. I have a child. I've been running Joyland since 2008, and I don't really have the place to be the editor-in-chief and the owner of Joyland anymore. Do you want to own Joyland? There was no sale. I didn't buy Joyland. But suddenly at the end of that lunch, I was in my mid 20s and I was running a literary journal. And I had really no idea what I was doing. And we did a huge rebrand of the site in summer 2020. We brought on a bunch of new editors. We completely changed how the site looks, and the whole branding of Joyland. And then we did another relaunch earlier this year, and that was a more expansive relaunch. So with that relaunch, we did away with this idea that with organizing the site by genre, or excuse me, by region. Um, for a few reasons. Frankly, writers were always really confused by it. We would get
Mm.
emails from writers saying, I'm based in the UK now. My story takes place in LA, but I grew up in Georgia. Where do I possibly submit? And instead, we've really tried to shift our focus to make sure that we are publishing writers who are not just based in Brooklyn. I'm based in Brooklyn myself. Many of our editors are, but we don't want Joyland to feel like it's just a magazine for people in New York and to feel really insular in that way. The other big change we made with the magazine, I stepped down as editor-in-chief of the magazine. I'm now the publisher. Devin Barraclough and Walker Kaplan are now the editors-in-chief of the magazine, and we launched Joyland Editions, which is the small press arm of Joyland. And we publish two novellas a year, one edited by myself and another edited by our editor, Maddie Crum. And our first book, Information Age by Cora Lewis, is coming out in July, and our second book is coming out in October.
Oh, wow.
So that was a lot of information, but I've been
Mhm.
with Joyland for a long time, and have helped facilitate a lot of changes with the magazine and now with
Yeah.
just the whole publishing house, I
Mhm.
guess.
That's great. So can I just ask, what does it mean when when someone takes over as owner, but there's not necessarily a sale, like you're not buying the magazine? Is it just like for tax purposes that you're technically the owner? Is it an LLC or how does that work?
Yeah, so for the purposes of Joyland, I can't speak to every magazine, obviously, but with Joyland, it was that I got to make all the final calls. So it used to
Mhm.
be, even when Emily was less involved, that if we wanted to say do away with the regions that Emily would have had the final say, or if we wanted to do a total site rebrand, or we have had to let editors go and we've brought new editors on. But in the past, Emily would have always had the final say. And so once I became the owner, the magazine really became what I wanted it to be.
Mm,
And there was no oversight. And yes, also that I was suddenly dealing with figuring out taxes. We became a
mm,
nonprofit at the beginning of this year as well. And Emily was incredible and did really help, especially in those early days, making sure that that was a seamless transition.
mm,
But yes, dealing both with the editorial vision of the magazine and the business side of the magazine.
I see. So what made you want to start a books division? That is quite an exciting undertaking, and I'm curious how you came to that.
Yeah, the real answer is that I had kind of lost my passion for the magazine. I
Mm,
still really loved editing stories and working with authors. But I found I'd been working on the magazine since 2015. I do I, Joyland could not exist without our editors, but I'm the one who's uploading the stories. I'm posting, making the social media posts and the social media graphics. And I really wasn't feeling excited about Joyland in the way that I once was.
mm,
And it felt unfair to the editors and unfair to the writers. And I started to feel like I was falling behind on emails, and I just didn't have that same passion I once did, which you really need when you're doing something that you're really not making money on.
mm,
Um, and I thought about it for a really long time. If it was time for me to step away from the magazine, if it was time for me to completely hand it over to someone else, and that didn't feel right. Um, but I had really lost like my why. And I had this idea that maybe we would publish a print journal, and we would publish an annual print journal or a biannual print journal. But I kept thinking like, well, there's so many fantastic print journals and we already publish online. Why would somebody go and pay $25 for a
mm,
Joyland print journal?
mm,
Could we be adding something that new to that space? And then I had this idea, well, maybe every issue would have a novella. I love the form of novellas. A lot of my friends have written novellas and have not been able to sell them because
mm.
the publishing industry, for the most part, doesn't love a novella, or at least that's sort of what they've always said. Um, and I found the more I thought about it, I just kept returning to this idea of the novellas. But I thought, okay, there's no way that I can possibly do that. How do you start a small press? But I started taking interviews, and people were kind enough to sit down with me for informational interviews. Chelsea Hodson at Rose Books, Lucy K. Shaw at Shabby Doll House, Alex Higley at Great Place Books, and they all walked me through how can you actually do this if you have limited funds, if you are just a couple people trying to make this happen.
Mm.
Is it possible? And I learned that the answer was yes, it is possible.
That's amazing. So you were just basically like, I am in this middle place and I am not going to step away. I'm going to actually lean in further. Do you feel like it's a big risky undertaking, or are you like in the throes of the excitement right now? And how it sounds like it's just very exciting and daunting.
It does feel it feels both exciting and daunting. So to answer your question is yes. I I worked in traditional publishing for many years. And I worked at Catapult when Andy Hunter made Catapult. I was there when it was Black Balloon. And I watched Andy really found Catapult. And that was such an illuminating experience. And it's something I've returned to a lot over the past year with creating Joyland Editions. Um, and I've realized I finally reached a point probably a couple months ago where I realized like we are going to get things wrong with Cora's book. There are going to be things that hopefully if this project is still around 5 years from now that we look back and go, oh my gosh, I can't believe we did that with Cora's book. We had no idea what we were doing. Um, but for the most part, I've been really moved by the reception of the book. I do think that people are really excited by a small press. I think people are excited by a small press that's championing novellas.
Mhm.
Um, and Maddie and I both it's not even about calling in every favor because this book is, I really think this book is so good. Um, and so I've just shared it with friends of mine who are writers or friends of mine who've worked in media and have said, listen, here's what I love about this book. If you read it and you don't like it, no pressure. We never have to talk about it again. But I hope that you read it and you love it as much as I do. And we've had a really great response so far, especially as a small press.
So you're making phone calls to do that promotional work as well. How does that work?
Yes. I also worked in publicity for many years. I worked as an assistant at Broadside PR,
Mm,
and the folks at Broadside, I think, are the best in publicity. They're
mm,
all brilliant, and really kind people as well. Um, and there were sort of two things that I learned from my time at Broadside that I've applied to Joyland Editions. One is Broadside had this idea. This is not a perfect formula, obviously, but that people have to see a book about 3 times before they buy it.
mm,
And so, someone might see it on an Instagram story, someone might see an excerpt in a magazine, and then somebody walks into a store, and that third time is when they're going to buy it.
mm,
We've really tried to focus on I'm about to quote something Andy said at Catapult. Andy would always say the goal isn't to be a household name, the goal is to be a name in the right houses.
mm,
So we've been thinking a lot about who are we going to send this book to? Who is the ideal audience for Cora? And not spreading ourselves, not casting such a wide net because we do have limited resources, but
mhm,
instead being really focused about who we reach out to.
mhm,
Um, and when we make those asks, or when we send those emails reaching out to people, I have found that just being really genuine is the best way to get a response. We're reaching out to Maddie and I are the ones reaching out to bookstores. We're reaching out to media. We're the ones reaching out asking for blurbs, or sometimes Cora is, and Cora's been fantastic. But we're reaching out to people who get hundreds of emails a day.
yeah.
And they don't want a publicity pitch. They don't want something that feels like it came from a media kit, or at least
Mhm,
that's my sense. And I have just really tried to email when I'm reaching out to people to think, why am I reaching out to this specific person? And like, we're not copying and pasting emails and saying like, I saw that you really liked this book, or so for instance, I just reached out to a bookseller at McNally Jackson who their staff favorites were in line with books I would see as comps for Cora's book.
mhm,
And I shared that in my email.
mhm. Yeah. So there's a question here. Has the defunding of the NEA affected the magazine, the press? Did you have grant funding coming in?
So we had planned to we had applied, but our first year being a nonprofit is 2025. So we were not yet relying on NEA funding. We are right now, we received a grant, a private grant, which was very generous from an author who asked to remain anonymous. We're mostly funded by Submittable.
Mhm,
And we are currently a finalist for the Firecracker Award, and we're continuing
mhm,
to apply to grants.
mhm,
The NEA funding obviously was completely demoralizing.
mhm,
And it was one of the reasons that we really worked to apply to be a nonprofit. So when it's become
mhm.
not really going to be something that we can do, that has
Yeah.
definitely changed things.
Another question, how has the starting of the press influenced editing of Joyland? And also, I'm curious, like, did you have to bring in more staff now? How is the staff sort of divided up between the two groups? And also, just to cover brass tacks with Joyland Magazine, if you would just tell us what you publish there. So, what do you publish on Joyland? And then how has starting the press influenced editing the magazine?
Sure. So, one of the other changes that we made at the start of the year was we decided to stop publishing creative nonfiction. We only publish fiction now. We do say that, we have a wide definition of fiction. So, as long as the author defines it as fiction, that works for
Mm,
us. Um, we've certainly published work that other journals might consider prose poems, but again, if the author thinks that it says it's fiction, that works for us. I am still editing for the magazine, but I'm no longer reading the submittable. I still go in there every now and then, but for the most part, Joyland Magazine and Joyland Editions are pretty divided. So Joyland Editions is myself, Maddie Crum, and Joe Baracci. One title is lead edited by Maddie, and one title is lead edited by myself, and then Joe helps with copy editing and additional editing and reading. We had our first open call earlier this year for Joyland Editions. The magazine, we would when Devin and Walker decided to take over, we really took a look at our editorial team and thought about, okay, who makes sense with the vision that Devin and Walker have for the magazine. Um, when I mentioned that when I took over Joyland, I really didn't know what I was doing. Was in graduate school. No, I just graduated graduate school. I was a couple years out. Um, and I brought on a ton of editors, and I had this policy that, okay, if an editor likes a story, we should just publish it. I don't need to have any final approval. And the result was that I don't think Joyland had any sort of unified voice. So
Mm,
somebody might read a story on Joyland and have never heard of us, and then go to another story, and it would be totally different.
mm,
And obviously, you want some variety in a literary journal, but I think there was a little bit too much variety.
mm,
So Devin Walker and I went through the editorial list. We had some editors who also hadn't edited a story in a long time. We spoke to editors, talked about whether they still had an interest in Joyland, if it still made sense for them to be Joyland, part of Joyland. Some editors, we said, thank you for your time, but we don't think it makes sense for you to continue on with us, which is a difficult conversation to
mm,
have, but everybody understood. And we brought on a bunch of new editors. We put everybody through an edit test where we gave them 3 different stories that we had received via submittable. We took off the names of all those stories, and we asked if they would accept those stories, what edits they would make.
mm,
We also asked them what are 3 to 5 Joyland stories that you really love, and what are 3 to 5 Joyland stories that you would not have published.
mm,
Um, and I think Devin and Walker put together a fantastic team. And now Devin and Walker both have top approval for all stories. But there's been some trial and error with figuring out how that works as well.
mm,
There have been stories where Devin and Walker maybe personally in their reading taste haven't liked the story, but they know that that story has merit.
mm,
And so they've decided to still publish the story. And figuring out, I think sometimes as an editor, okay, it obviously is your taste. You want to like the stories, but you also are trying to figure out, okay, this might not be my favorite story and the story that I align with, but I know that this is a fantastic story and we should
mm,
publish it.
mm, mm. How would you describe, so you mentioned the sort of cohesive identity of Joyland. How would you describe it?
Yeah, I think we're most interested in distinct voice.
Mhm,
Um, there's an acronym that I heard in graduate school that has sort of haunted me since graduate school, and the acronym is PLOF, and it stands for Proficient, Literary, and Ultimately Forgettable.
mm,
That is sort of mean, but what I think when I think of that acronym, I think of a story that's really tidy and functioning really well on a technical level, but you have no real sense of there's no sense of urgency in the story. You have no sense of why this writer wrote this story, and there's really no distinct voice. And I think sometimes when people hear voice driven, they think like Dennis Johnson or like really obvious examples.
mhm,
But we're just looking for something that feels particular to that story and to that author,
mhm,
where you can start to read the sentences and they don't have to be these um, like high level experimental sentences, but that it does feel like something that we've never read before. Whereas I think
mhm,
sometimes we get really fantastic stories, but they feel like something I've read before, or they
mhm,
feel like the story is maybe a bit underbaked or the writer is still getting their footing. And I look back on stories I wrote years ago, and so much of what I was doing was copying the people I love, frankly. And
mhm,
I hadn't yet found my voice, and I'm still, I think, finding my voice. And I think it's it's hard because it's something that defies craft. It's the thing that you can't fake.
Hmm.
But I think that really is what we're looking
Mm.
for.
That's interesting. Yeah. So does that apply to novella submissions as well?
Absolutely, yeah. So the novella I'm working on is by a writer named Sophie Strawmeyer, and it's called All Girls Be Mine Alone. I
Mm.
had reached out to Sophie last summer and told her about the project of Joyland Editions, and she had published with Joyland. That's how I heard about or was first introduced to to Sophie's writing. She published a story that I did not edit, but that I loved. I reached out to her. I asked if she had a novella, and she said, "Oh, I'm actually working on making that Joyland story a novella, but it's
Oh,
not."
wow.
Yeah, yes, wonderful, great news for me. But she said it's not done yet. Can I send you 25 pages and a treatment? And that is what she did. And I fell in love with the voice. It was just,
Mm.
I'm sure we all have those writers where you're like, I would read anything, but I would just read this person describing walking through the grocery store.
Mhm.
And that's how I felt about Sophie's voice. And she
Mhm.
had a really detailed plan as well. And we had about a 2 hour meeting where I told her my thoughts on the book. I asked her a lot of questions about the book, but, you know, figuring out pacing and character development and this we need a little bit more from this scene and can we clarify this, all of that I think can be fixed in editing, especially if the
Mhm.
writer is game to be edited.
Mhm.
But the voice is the thing that you really can't,
Yeah.
you can't edit it in. You can't
Mhm.
tell somebody make this voice stronger. You sort of either have it or you don't.
Mhm.
And Sophie, at least with this project, I just fell in love, absolutely fell in love with the voice.
Mm, that's so interesting. So for novella, can you tell us about the form and what draws you to the novella form? I admit I haven't actually read many novellas, so I'm not too well versed in the form, but I'm curious, like, are you reading more and more novellas and like what are you learning about the form and what do you love about it?
Yeah. Um, Part of what I love about the form is I do think that it lends books to be read more, it lends itself for the books to be read more than once.
Mm,
Now, I do think that most people are still reading books front to back. Um, but like the short story, I think a good short story becomes better with each read and becomes more complex with each read.
mm,
I think the same is true of novellas. Um, I also do think that it's a form where voice really tends to shine and where
mm,
you tend to prioritize voice over um, plot, at least in the traditional sense, although I think that I'm not one of those people who thinks plot is a dirty word. I happen to feel like I need plot. And Sophie's book and Cora's book, I would think are very plotted, even if maybe not in a traditional sense. And to be entirely honest, I also really wanted to publish a form that I didn't feel the publishing industry was
mm,
properly championing. So I mentioned
mm,
that I worked at Catapult and I was an editorial assistant at the time. It was a great learning experience. I really enjoyed my time there. But I would come sometimes to the editors with this fantastic book. And I would say, oh my gosh, I've never read anything like this. I love this so much. I'd write a glowing editorial letter and I would be told, oh, it's 60,000 words. No one's going to buy it.
mm.
And I didn't understand that. It was sort of baffling to me. And there are so many examples of books that are in the novella word range that when I was working at Catapult, Department of Speculation had just come out.
Mm,
It's a book that I think probably technically is a novella, even if it
mhm,
wasn't marketed as such. Um, but Maddie and I really liked the idea of having a form that the publishing industry wasn't championing. And I think in general, Maddie and I both feel pretty disillusioned with certain things about the publishing industry and
mhm,
what books get a ton of publicity and why, and what books get a ton of money and why. And I think there are also a lot of, to be clear, that I think there are a lot of books that get a ton of attention and deserve that attention.
mhm,
But we've had so many writers reach back out. We've reached out to writers and then they reach back out to us and say, I was working on a novella, but my agent told me to stop because it would never sell. And so I find it meaningful that we are
mhm,
creating a press that at least allows writers to work in this form that they'd be
mhm.
interested in, but because of the market, maybe have um, turned their back to.
Yeah. Do you think, is there something unique about novellas that they can do? You mentioned that voice really shines in novellas. Is there something like fewer plot threads or more compression, or is there something about the form that enables certain aspects of craft to sort of come to the surface?
Yeah, I do think that they have a really, I mean, literally you're working with less words, you have a smaller
Mhm.
container. So for instance, Cora's book really takes place over the course of a year.
Mm,
Sophie's book is told in two parts. The first part takes place over the course of about 6 months, and the second part only takes place over the course of a day,
mm,
actually a night. And it's a woman recounting a story, and what Sophie does with, I'm very interested in time in general, and what Sophie does with that book in time I think is just fantastic. um but I do think that it's, novellas, I think because of their form, wind up being much quieter books, and they're more
mm,
about interiority, and they tend to be, rather than sort of big explosive moments or covering very long periods of time.
mm,
They wind up being books that are more concerned with an individual's experience.
mm.
Um, and it's occurring to me that our first four books will all be told in the first person, which I, until this moment, did not. Um, but I think part of that is probably related both to voice and related to, you don't really need the expansiveness of the third person.
Mm,
This is not, it's, there are obviously going to be exceptions, but I think that the novella always, all the novellas I'm thinking of, or that we're publishing, excuse me, and the novellas I love, they almost feel like somebody telling you a secret. And
mm, mm,
and there's a real quiet quality to them, and nothing huge happens. And instead it's driven by a person changing in some way that
mm.
might not be clear on the
Mhm.
outside.
Mhm. Yeah. So how are you, like, are you providing advances to the authors and doing all this publicity? I'm just so curious. Like, we don't have to get too much into the finances, but I'm curious, how are you, with just like this small operation, how are you funding it and sort of sustaining it?
Yeah, so we are paying the writers, all writers, all the novella writers are paid the same amount, and all our magazine writers are paid the same amount as well. Our editors are paid a stipend per story. Maddie and I are not being paid for this work.
Mm,
And so the way that it operates
mm,
is on a real shoestring budget. And this is part of where calling in every favor really comes
mm,
in. And this is when it really does feel like calling in a favor. So, for instance, we had a party a couple weekends ago, just letting some people in the industry know about Cora's book. And a friend of mine was very kind enough to open up his home to us, and we hosted the party there. And then another friend of mine owns a wine store and gave us a huge discount on buying bulk wine.
mm.
And so you become very comfortable, or you have to become very comfortable with asking for favors.
Mm,
And I teach full time. Um, Last week was the last week of the semester, and then I'm starting up again in a couple weeks. Maddie works full time, so it's a lot of finding time at after work, early in the morning, on weekends. And I think that that is honestly the biggest struggle of figuring out,
mm.
okay, how are we going to find the time? How are we going to find the money?
Yeah.
And I'll be honest, we don't pay our writers enough for them to, quit their job. And I wish that we could pay them more. Um, and hopefully we will get funding to be able to pay them more.
Mhm.
But I, I think I really care about literature, and Maddie
Yeah.
does as well. And I think what we're driven by is really wanting to make the publishing world better and to publish
Mhm.
work that maybe otherwise would not see the light of day.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I believe it. I think you would have to care very passionately to do this in your free time. That's amazing. And you're a writer as well. We're getting hearts. Louis sending up hearts.
That's very nice.
And you're a writer. I think you mentioned that. Like,
I
and
am.
you
I'm working on a
write
manuscript.
frequently. Yeah.
I have no idea when it will be done. Yes, I am trying to find time to write, but yes, I'm working.
Right, right, sure. Are you finding a connection with an audience and readers?
Yeah. Do you mean for the magazine or for the novellas?
Or I meant for the novellas, but I'm curious with the magazine as well. With the magazine, I assume that there's sort of an audience because it's been around for so long. So
Yeah.
maybe we'll start with the novella and then we can shift back and ask more questions about the magazine.
Yeah, right now pre-orders are open. Excuse me, for Information Age. And really had no idea how many pre-orders to expect. I've never run a small press before, and we exceeded my expectations. I won't get into exact numbers. Most of those people haven't read the book yet because it doesn't come out till July. But the fact that we're every day we have a few new pre-orders rolling in, and I get excited every single time I get one of those emails.
Mhm.
And the people who have read the book, we've sent around e-arcs, and we printed a very limited series of print arcs, really just for bookstores and places that were requesting print arcs. And I thank you to the CUNY Copy Center for allowing me to print those. Uh, we've really heard very kind things about the book,
Mhm.
and we've had people, some authors reach back out to us and say, hey, I read this book. If you would like me to write a blurb, I'd be happy to do so.
Wow, that's great.
One, it's so meaningful to have authors who I admire and who Cora admires say kind things about the book. But also, I do think on some, I'm repeating myself now, but people I think are really excited to champion a small press and sort of understand that, we don't have a publicity budget. Everything that we're doing, we are doing, just Maddie and I, and anytime anyone, even post it on their Instagram story, that just makes that much more of a difference. And I think people are really game to understand that and to help out in any way they can if they do really love the book. With the magazine, we're actually still expanding our audience. So I had the goal this year of trying to get us to 10,000 Instagram followers. We are almost there. I'm very excited. Because you're right, we do have um, a pretty robust following already. We have people who have been following the magazine for years. We're really lucky about that. But I think that, you know, I mentioned I sort of lost my passion for the magazine. And with that, I think I wasn't thinking about, okay, how can we be reaching new people?
Mm.
Um, so I've um, re I, some of it I think happens from social media, and um, we've grown our Instagram following by almost 4,000 people just in the past year or since the beginning of the year, which has been great. Our readership is up. And I do think that just we are reaching new and more people. Um, but we are constantly thinking about, okay, how can we reach people, especially outside of our networks? Like how can
Mhm.
we return to this idea that we're not a magazine based in Brooklyn for people in Brooklyn? Um, and this, I think, is where having editors in other states come in. So
Mm.
I don't really know anything about the writing scene out in LA, for instance, but we have an editor who's in LA.
Mm.
And so he can say, okay, there's this reading series that's going on that a lot of people are attending. We should try to get a Joyland reader there,
Mm.
etc.
Mhm. Question here, what characterizes Joyland Magazine stories?
I think it's similar to what we look for in the novellas, where we are really interested in voice. But I mentioned that I'm not somebody who thinks of plot as a dirty word. I really need something more than just voice. Um, we actually there was a novella that I really fell in love with. And I just from and actually this person has submitted stories to us as well, and I had the same problem with their stories. I loved their stories, but I found that by like the 20th page with their novella or by like the second page with their story, I really had no sense of why I was reading what I was reading, and that
Mhm.
there wasn't any through line. And plot, I think people hear that word and they think like that has to mean an explosion or an affair or something huge. And plot is just a sequence of events.
Mhm.
It's just an occasion for the telling of the story. It's a reason why we're entering this story at this particular moment. That can be something internal, it can be something external, but we have to have an understanding of why we're there and some through line that's pulling us from the
Mhm.
beginning of the page to the end. Um, I think we also look for stories that feel like they're defamiliarizing something in some way.
Mhm.
So we get a lot of stories about I don't know why we get or I do know why we get so many stories about this because it's a fraught experience and we get a lot of stories about couples trying to conceive and being unable to do
Interesting.
that. And that is an interesting experience. There's a lot there, but
Mhm.
you need to be able, and I'm just using this as this example as an example. Um, you need to be able to defamiliarize that in some way. There needs to be
Mhm.
something that makes that story different. It can come from character. Maybe there's a speculative bend. It can come from voice. It can come from there being some sort of plot twist. And I don't mean like a murder in the middle, but some sort of way the plot takes on an unexpected turn. But whatever your story is doing, it should feel specific to you in some way and specific to
Mhm.
your vision and to your point of view. And I think a lot of times with stories, the issue is not, let me pause. I always say that there's like sort of three types of stories we get from the Joyland submittable. We get the stories that are immediately yeses. They're so fantastic. Oh my gosh, we have to publish this. Press accept now, or somebody else is going to publish it. We get the stories that are immediately no's. We don't publish genre, for instance, we'll get like a traditional genre story, or we'll just get a story that's really clearly not at the level that it's ready to be published at all. And then we get the third category of the story, this third category, and this is where most stories fall, where the story is really strong, it's good, it's proficient, it's technically sound, but I finish it and a couple days go by and I completely have forgotten the story.
Mhm.
And so there needs to be something memorable about the story. It's not just enough for the story to be good.
Mhm.
And I think some of that comes with stepping away from the story. So I always recommend that writers, once they've finished a story and they're so excited to have finished it, before you submit to anyone, take 3 months away from it, sometimes longer, sometimes less. It depends on the story, but like generally 3 months, and return to it with fresh eyes. And you might see certain things that you didn't see before. Because I think there is an issue with stories getting sent when they're a bit underbaked.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. That's interesting that I've actually never heard that from an editor that the stories about people trying to conceive is a common subject.
I don't,
It,
and who knows why it was almost laughable at one point that we were getting so many stories about that. So it's always the example I use because it is, ripe for plot. There's so much
right.
there, but there also needs to be more.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Is there something you tend to see a lot of stylistically? I guess you mentioned sort of these forgettable stories or stories maybe that are attempting experimentation in some way that don't quite pull it off, or are there certain other types of stories that uh, tend to get rejected?
Yeah, I mentioned that we really care about voice, but I think there's a certain type of story where the voice feels really put on.
Mm.
And it almost feels like a writing exercise. Like we'll get like an example I'm thinking of is like we might get a story set in the South and everyone is being called like mama and papa. That's not to say that we could get it and we have published stories that have people being called mama and papa, but it feels authentic to that person and that
Hmm.
character. And you can just sort of, I mean, like when you're talking to someone, you can sniff out when someone is being authentic or not.
Hmm.
Um, and I think, I don't know, this is sort of like such general advice that it's probably not helpful, but I do think it's true. If you're struggling with a story and it starting to feel like walking through quicksand for you, the I think the reader will have that experience as
Mm.
well. And to not put on a voice just for the sake of having a voice-driven story, that
Yeah.
the voice has to feel it doesn't have to be your voice. There
Mhm.
are so countless examples of people taking on somebody else's voice and doing it in a way that works. But really consider why you're using a particular voice. And if the answer is just, well, I want to have a strong voice or I want to write a voice-driven story, that's probably not a good enough reason.
Mhm. Do you work with writers on revision? I'm guessing, I don't know about the magazine, but certainly it seems like with the press, you would be working with novella writers for revision.
Yeah, I work with writers on revision for both the magazine and the press. One of the problems with the publishing industry that Maddie and I wanted to address, and something Walker, Devin, and I talk a lot about, is that what I'm about to say is not true of every editor. There are brilliant, brilliant editors, but editors at traditional houses are being overworked right now, and they're
Mm.
not editing probably as much as they would want to and as much as they should be. And I really view editing as an art form as much as writing.
Hmm.
Um, that being said, I am a believer that the writer's the person who knows what's at the heart of a story. So my editing style is I usually go in, I make copy edits, and then I write a long editorial letter and I say, basically, this is how I understand your story. This is what's standing out to me about this story. And here's where I think we could emphasize what I think your story is interested in. But I let the writer make the final call. And we'll usually have some sort of back and forth. So I might say, your story should end on page 9 versus page 10 for reasons
Hmm.
Y and Z. And the writer will explain to me why they think it should end on page 10, and we might go back and forth for a bit. But I really want, both with the magazine and with the press, for the writing and editing relationship to be collaborative, but for the writer at the end of the day to be the one who gets the final call.
Hmm.
So when I take on a story at the magazine, and we instruct all of our editors to do this,
Hmm.
they accept a story. They say, I would like to accept your story. I do have a few edits. Here is a brief outline of my edits. You would get final call on all the edits, and
Hmm.
editor should not be taking on stories at the magazine if they wouldn't be happy with the story being published without those
Hmm.
edits.
Hmm. So what makes you reject a story versus accept it, but with revisions?
Um, the answer is sort of simple. It's that I have to know how to solve the problems of a story. Sometimes I will, sometimes I'll even really like a story and I'll be like, oh, this is a fantastic story. I'm not the right editor for it. And then I'll sometimes send it to a different editor, see if they might be the right editor for it.
Mhm.
Um, but when I'm in editing mode, it almost feels, like the experience of having a bunch of puzzle pieces laid out, and suddenly you see how all of them should go together.
Mhm.
If I can't figure out how everything should go together and really don't think that I don't know, if I don't know how to make a story better, it doesn't matter how much I love that story as a
Yeah.
reader, I'm not the right editor for it.
Hmm.
So I need to be able to have really specific edits. I try not to have too prescriptive of edits, but I do need to be able to explain why I'm making a particular edit. Um, and I need to be able to really understand a story if I'm working on it.
Sure, that makes sense. Yeah. I like the way I like the way you edit. It was sort of like open-minded, like you're not imposing advice or like prescriptive actions that the writer should take. You're sort of asking kind of open-ended questions and letting them find more of the story to bring it to the surface.
I think that comes from being a writer myself
Hmm.
and, I've received prescriptive edits and have then published work that I've been like, oh, I'm excited to have published that story, but I actually am not that excited because I made a bunch of changes I wish I hadn't made. And we never want writers to feel that way. Um, and, you know, I only can give suggestions that kind of that I would make as a writer. So I sort of come from it. It's like giving advice to a friend.
Hmm.
You're not going to tell a friend exactly what they should do, but you might be like, okay, well, why are you feeling this way? And what would it feel like if you did this? And well, here's what I would do if it were me. And why don't we talk through a few different options? And you tell me how they all sound to you. But you don't want to just give one suggestion and act like you know
Mhm.
absolutely what's right because you just don't.
Yeah. Yeah. I think sometimes the biggest problem with editorial suggestions is the writer not knowing how to implement those suggestions. So, like, you come out of a workshop and you hear you need more conflict, you need more character development, but you don't necessarily know how to work that into the revision.
Yeah, I've tried to find a balance there because I think you're exactly right.
Mm.
You can say we need more conflict. Okay, well, where? So I might say something like, I need more conflict between the mother and the daughter.
Mhm.
This scene on page 3, I think, could be a really interesting, like the right place where we could do this, or maybe on page 5, but open to other options as well, and sort of giving them a few ideas. And page 3 or page 5 might not be the right option, but I think that just opens them up to understanding at least what you mean.
Mhm.
And then they might say, okay, Michelle's suggestions are wrong, but I understand what she's asking now, so I'm going to make this change at
Mhm.
the end or wherever.
Mhm. Have you been inundated with submissions for novellas?
Yes, we opened submissions for the month of April, and we'll be reopening in early fall.
Mhm.
And we received about 300 submissions.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, and you're aiming to publish two per year, is that
Yes.
right? So
Yes.
how will that work? Like, do you anticipate getting, let's say you find, four great novellas in this batch, and then you'll be sort of booked up for the next few years? Is that a
Yeah. Well, first off, I'll say if we're lucky enough to get funding, we would love to publish more than 2 a year. I don't see that happening necessarily, but if anybody knows any ways to get money, please let me know. Um, yes, so we would ideally want to be publishing. We really want to have our 2027 list booked out, um, because we're still Sophie's book comes out in October. We're still copy editing for it. We're still doing publicity for Cora's book, and it comes out in July. It would be nice for Maddie and I to be able to catch our breath a little bit by being ahead of the editorial calendar.
Mhm.
Um, but at the same time, we want to be as we really only want to publish books that we are absolutely in love with. And I do think this is one of the distinctions of what we're choosing or what I'm choosing to publish on the magazine versus um, online, or excuse me, on with the magazine versus the press. So the magazine's all online. We do pay our writers, so we have a limited amount of stories we can publish a year. But and I everything that I've ever worked on the magazine, I really love. But uh, you work on a story for a couple months, you publish it, you promote it for a couple weeks on social media, and then you're sort of done with it.
Mhm.
Like then you submit it to prizes. But when you're working on a book, you're working on it for 2 years, maybe more. And you want to keep promoting the book long after it's out. And you just it's not enough to just really, really like it. I've published stories that I really, really, really like, but maybe haven't necessarily loved.
Mhm.
There are certain stories that are more special to me. And Maddie and I realized really early on, especially because we're doing all this work for free, we have to love these books. And
Mhm.
I love Cora's book and I love Sophie's book. They are two of my favorite books I've ever read. I can't believe that we're the ones who get to publish them.
Mhm. That's
Uh,
amazing.
thank
That's
you.
great.
So, we've received so many incredible novella submissions. And again, we return to that question of like, okay, but do we love this enough to work on it for 2 years? Do we
Mm.
love this enough to be up at 3 in the morning, or giving up our Saturday or giving up our Sunday, giving up our writing day and our day with our loved ones, our time with our loved ones for this book? And like sometimes the answer is just no. And not because the book is bad, but just because there's not that connection that, you can't fake. It's the thing that all feel as readers. Some
Mhm.
books you just feel differently about them and you don't even necessarily know why.
Mhm. It's really incredible. I mean, your devotion to other people's work. And I think I would imagine most editors feel this way, and that's why they do what they do. But you're sort of taking it to the next level with this, with the press. It's just, it's incredible. So do you feel like you're like these books are your own in some way, like you have the connection and the passion for them as you would something, maybe, I mean, I could even understand like in some ways it's easier to work on other people's books and like promote them because there's some distance from
Yeah.
them.
I think it's the latter. I think probably every writer, I have a tortured relationship with my own writing. I have that experience of being at my computer and just, thinking, wow, I'm the worst writer that was
Mm.
ever existed. That thing that I think every writer has thought. Um, and to be able to work on somebody else's writing,
Mm.
and to only feel excited about it and to
Mhm.
only want to promote it. And I feel strange about self-promotion as well. It's sort of this thing
Mhm.
that we have to do, but it feels bizarre to do. And, but to promote Sophie and Cora's book and to promote the work from the magazine only feels exciting to me because I really
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So I think it's actually helped my relationship with my writing, um, in that now my writing really feels, I don't know. I think I feel maybe like my writing is more just for me. I don't know. I don't know. I think I it has helped that self-loathing voice in my head go away a bit,
Mm.
by having something connected to the so-called publishing world that really has nothing to do with me, Michelle, but instead it's
Mhm.
about other people and getting to promote the work of other people,
Mhm.
has been incredibly helpful and much.
Yeah, that's interesting. Is there anything particular that you want to see more of in novellas? I know you mentioned voice is very important, authenticity, but I don't know, is there some like topic or some region of the world, or is it really just how the writer pulls off the work?
Yeah, I would love to see more works in translation, to be honest. In general, we're interested in publishing works in translation. Um, I'm a queer writer, and so I'm always very interested in queer stories.
Mm.
I'm a queer person, not just a queer writer. I'm interested in, I, this is not a entirely helpful answer, but I do think any story that is not typically told, like any story that the publishing industry might shy away from
Mm.
for any reason. Or I won't say any story, but um, I think being 23 and working at Catapult, which again was a really incredible experience, but there were parts of it that were really demoralizing because I saw that book publishing is a business and, they're trying to make money, which is not there's nothing in it that's not like inherently greedy. That's not bad.
Mm.
But there would be conversations about, well, books about this don't sell and books about that don't sell. And I remember being told once books about sisters don't sell. And just sort of these like absurd, we need a love story. We need a like these. And from my point of view, I'm a reader. Like I love
Right.
anything that's good will find an audience. And maybe I'm naive in thinking that.
Yeah.
But um, I am interested in maybe quieter stories, that maybe the publishing industry, for whatever wrong reasons, have shied away from. I'm very disinterested in nihilism. I'm very
Mm.
disinterested in, apathy.
Mhm.
I think both my and Maddie's taste maybe skews a little bit more sentimental than is trendy right now. I like books with a lot of heart. I like books with a lot of feeling. I'm not interested in books that feel sort of cool and removed. Um, something I this is hopefully this is okay that I'm about to say this. I said to Maddie very early in this process, books should be read. They're not objects to do. They should not be seen as objects to do drugs off of. Like I'm having stuff like I I you know
Now you're telling me.
we're not. I'm not really interested in sort of like a cool, unaffected tone.
Yeah.
I want something that feels like it has a great deal of heart and love to it.
hmm hmm Yeah, I realized that about myself recently. Maybe it's getting older or something, I don't know, but I realized like some of the trendier books that have that kind of nihilistic affect just don't really they don't do it for me. So
Yeah, yeah. And we got some, some of those submissions when we made the call for the novellas and, had strong voices. They were proficient, but we're just not the right publisher for them.
hmm hmm
And I think both Sophie and Cora's book, they're not overly sweet or corny, but they're books with like a great deal of sentiment in them. And I think they're
hmm
really beautiful books. And I can sort of physically feel my heart when I read both of those books.
That's lovely. So if somebody is listening to this and they want to get involved, it sounds like maybe you could use help. I don't know.
Yes.
But are you ever looking for volunteer readers? Is there a way for people to sort of participate in the project?
Yes, so we're actually looking for readers right now. We pay our readers a stipend of $50 a month. And it by no means do we see it as a full-time position. It's usually like a couple hours of work a week. If that, and people can step away when they need to. And our readers are seasonal positions. So we're currently looking for our summer readers, and then we'll be looking for our fall readers later in the summer, probably around July and August. But we accept those submissions on a rolling basis. So if anyone is ever interested in being a reader, they should reach out to Joyland Magazine at joylandmagazine.com. Or if they want to be a reader for the novella side, Joyland Editions at joylandmagazine.com. Um, and what else? We have a very, very tight budget, so we're not, we've had some people who've reached out to us about asking if they can help with publicity, asking if they can help with copy editing, and unfortunately, we don't have the
Mhm.
budget to bring those people on at the moment, but we're hoping to grow as time moves on.
Mhm. Well, this has been great. I have one final question. This is a question that I ask all editors, although I think mostly you've answered it already, but I'm just curious, like, what keeps you doing this work? You have so many you're teaching full time, which is amazing. And then you have family obligations and, social obligations and your own writing. And so surely there are moments where you're thinking, like, why am I, why am I doing this? Why am I investing so much in this? And in those moments, what keeps you going?
I think it's that I really care about literature and the publishing industry, and I've
Mhm.
worked in the publishing industry in a bunch of different areas, and there have been times where I've been really frustrated with the publishing industry, and times where I've had, I've seen friends of mine who I thought their book was just brilliant, and it went out on submission, and they got responses from editors, and were just told like, no, we don't know how to sell this book.
Yeah.
And then you see, I'm not even thinking of a specific book here, and like I said, I think there are a lot of books that get a lot of attention and should that attention is deserved. But sometimes you see a book that gets a ton of attention, you're like, what? Why? And I have felt increasingly frustrated with the traditional publishing industry. There are so many indies and small presses doing absolutely incredible things. Seven Stories, Grey Wolf, Soft Skull, the list goes on. And I think there are editors at the bigger houses that are taking on like amazing books and taking risks on really, really incredible books. So I'm speaking very broadly right now. Um, but when I realized like, oh, I have the ability to do some small thing in the publishing industry, that I take that really seriously and that's really meaningful to me. And that has really been the motivating force for me.
Yeah.
Because I think if, I don't know, I don't think it's groundbreaking news to say that the publishing industry is at least parts of it are in trouble and
Mhm.
the people, it's only going to be okay if the people who are in it work to make sure it's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Well, thank you so much, Michelle. This is very inspiring and interesting. So thanks for taking the time today. And thank you, everyone, for coming out.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Becky. This was a blast.